Good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Energy Network seminars. And this week we're pleased to have Sarah Rosenberg-Jansen, who will be examining technologies, policies and governance for sustainable energy in, well, let's call it displacement situations. We can go into that in a little bit more detail. I'm just going to take a couple of seconds to remind you that next week we're going to be having a talk from Queen's College distinguished visitor Julie Newman. She's over from MIT talking about sustainability on the campus, because I think that's quite a critical opportunity for us to engage with that topic. That talk is going to be in the Physics Lecture Theatre, Martin Wood Lecture Theatre, and there's a booking link on the Oxford Energy website for that. But back to today and Sarah. She has over 15, and I can't count correctly, but experience in energy and development, including various roles at Practical Action, which culminated in Head of Humanitarian Energy. She's also worked as Energy Advisor for Department of International Development and as an independent consultant, amongst other roles. And Sarah's research at University of Oxford focused on the social life of energy in refugee camps, which is, to me, a distressingly common situation, but also addressing inclusivity with energy solutions in times of crisis. Sarah, I understand you're co-chair of the Data and Evidence Working Group of the Global Plan of Action for Sustainable Energy Solutions and Situations of Displacement, and GPA for short. And I understand you encourage people with interest in the area to join the practitioners community on LinkedIn as well. So with no further ado, Sarah, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will never ever get used to wincing through the intros myself, but maybe at some point, 20 years, another 20 years. So thank you for the lovely introduction. Yeah, the talk's going to be about sustainable energy in refugee camps specifically. I will talk today about humanitarian energy in refugee camps specifically, but I'll also touch on a few other different types of contexts. Importantly, I think I won't just talk about energy, not as in the technologies and the physical products and services. I will talk about access to sustainability and governance and politics as well, particularly in the case, excuse me, of camps in the global south in places like Kenya and Rwanda and places. The work that I'll present today is a combination of the academic research that I've spent the last 9-10 years doing, including focusing on camps in Kenya and Rwanda. I did over 200 ethnographic interviews for that with policymakers, implementers, refugees themselves, and the combination with my practitioner research, where I've been working as a practitioner, as Robin said, for quite some time now. That's a much more focused piece of work, and it's largely quantitative, secondary data analysis of quantitative materials, and also working with practitioners to understand their perspectives on things. And what I would say, the reason I put up this slide is that you can't have one without the other in my little bubble, and that all that journal papers and presenting at research conferences and the sort of intellectual rigor that the academic side brings is very, very important to underpin the data and the actual evidence that sits here in the practitioner side. But also the reverse is true. You know, the access to some of these spaces, actually understanding how humanitarian institutions act, that wouldn't be possible without the practitioners. And sometimes in academic circles, I see practice research disparaged. That's a polite way of putting it. But in my bubble, it just wouldn't be possible. Let's touch for a minute on refugees and who are refugees and who are displaced people. Displaced people is the umbrella term for anybody who has had to move from their home for any reason. Forcibly displaced people are usually people who have moved due to war or conflict, and refugees are a subset of that community. So refugees are people who have been forced over a border, and the term for people who haven't been forced over a border is internally displaced people, sometimes called refugees within their own country. And you'll see some of the stats up here. I always put up the 102 million figure because in 2022, the last official statistic for millions of forcibly displaced people in the world was 102 million forcibly displaced people. However, it's now over 110 million. So that's a really substantial amount of the world. And as you can see from these other figures, only 20 or so million of those people are actually refugees. The vast majority of forcibly displaced people are internally displaced people. And when we talk about humanitarian energy, we talk about the whole shebang. And then there's other categories of asylum seekers, returnees, stateless people, and other persons of concern. And you may well ask me, what the hell is other persons of concern? Surely that's all the categories. But for lots of political reasons, where refugees or forcibly displaced people aren't recognised, in the case of Venezuela, for example, they are categorised as other. Make of that what you will. Today we are going to focus on camps. Most people would imagine a refugee camp to look a little bit like that, and that is indeed Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where I've spent quite a lot of time. But the energy picture of refugee life and displaced life is much broader than that. And when we talk about energy as displacement, we don't just talk about camps. So I think many people also have the image of that, with the very organised little tents as a refugee camp, and that is indeed Azraq in Jordan. But refugee life is also the middle picture, where people are living in urban environments. It's also transit camps and emergency situations for delayed cooking here. It's also formalised tents and structures like this IKEA Foundation shelter. It's also very informal dwellings with all the firewood across the middle picture there. And sometimes people sitting right next to national grids and grid connections. So there's a lot of different things, and I always put up these pictures to show the huge diversity. This is just a sample of 6 pictures of that diversity, of the huge diversity of energy needs of displaced people. Importantly, the energy needs of displaced people is not just in their homes, and anybody who's an energy professional will know that, and that will seem like a stupid thing to say. But when I present this to humanitarians, they're like, oh, really? Okay, they have their businesses and their shops and their community facilities and their institutions and their schools, etc., etc. Energy is all around us, of course, and the same is true in refugee camps. It's not just in people's houses, well, houses, tents, dwellings. And of course, energy is cooking as well as electricity, and cooking is a sort of forgotten element of this. Many people in the global south and in refugee camps specifically use firewood for cooking, brought in on trucks like situations like this, or on trucks, and sometimes people use charcoal when they can get hold of it. For those of you who love a definition, this is the definition of humanitarian energy. It's the umbrella. It's the institutions, policies, programs, initiatives, everything that use both sustainable and fossil fuel sources in all contexts of displacement. So that's camps, urban settings, self-settled refugees who aren't sort of identifying in a particular space, host communities, which are communities around refugee camps and IDP camps, and of course, internally displaced people. And humanitarian energy covers both emergencies and protracted situation, and all the causes as well. So it's the umbrella term. If people have been forced to move, this is the term we use. There's some debate about that within the practitioner sector, because the UN institutions don't love to have it one term. They like to use millions of different terms to make themselves seem important. But this is the sort of generalized accepted definition, I guess. I'm going to present now a couple of findings from my own research, which I hope you'll find interesting, useful. Again, findings from both the academic side and the practitioner side, for those of you who are interested in policy and practice. The one with all the logos on that picture is the State of the Humanitarian Energy Sector report, and it's actually a report series over a number of years, in which all those different practitioner organisations, big UN bodies, big NGOs, etc., all the main actors working in the space, come together every year to write a report on how the sector is moving. And so some of the stats I'll talk about today are from our research for that, and some I've published in this Energy Research and Social Science Journal article on the emerging world of humanitarian energy, which I'm quite proud of in its own small little way. So who lacks access to energy and refugee camps? Access rates are falling in real terms. This is some Chatham House modelling from a couple of years ago that suggests 94% of displaced people living in camps do not have meaningful access to power, and 81% lack anything other than the most basic fuels for cooking. So it's quite a high rate of people who don't have access, and these percentages are actually increasing, i.e. the situation is getting worse over years, and that is not because people are losing access to energy, although in some cases they are. It's because the rate of displacement overall has increased so rapidly. It's also challenging to find actual data on this, and the last real modelling was done in 2022, and there hasn't been a 2023 or 2024 update, for lots of different reasons. But there is no one data source you can go to get the data on this. You have to do it yourself. And in Chatham House's case, they did it themselves in 2022. And a big message coming away from this is that achieving Sustainable Goals, Development Goal 7, SDG 7, which is the energy SDG, is further away than ever in displacement contexts. So it's a pretty awful picture.
In the impact with people, would it be like, you know, that they could have to charge a phone?
No, and that's it's coming. Because I'm going to now present 1,000 pictures, which will hopefully more than answer that question. I like to show pictures because I could do this with data and stats, etc. But a picture speaks 1,000 words, and I hope this is going to be true of this as well. So I'll come to your question in a minute about spaces where people can charge mobile phones. For cooking, people are quite often using very small pots and pans and 3-stone fires, which are exactly what they sound like. It's 3 stones put together with some fire underneath it. Sometimes groups like UNHCR and NGOs are distributing firewood sticks like that. But most often people are buying, for cooking, they are buying cook stoves like this one, and all matches and fuel and things that you would need, like cooking accessories, you can think of them like that, from shops like the one where you see the lady with the skirt working outside. And they're also buying supplementary fuel, as well as the firewood that might be distributed for free. They're going to markets. This is a charcoal market. It might not look like that, but that's what it is. And people will trade and buy different amounts of charcoal, and they will do what's called fuel stacking and cook stove stacking, and they can just cook with whatever they can get their hands on. So that's cooking. For lighting, many people, especially in Kenya and Rwanda, will still use burning sticks for light, or the torch from their mobile phone if it's charged. In some cases, solar products like the ones you've seen here, the solar lantern, will be distributed, or the small blue lanterns. It's really hard to take pictures of solar energy technology on the tops of refugee tents. Or they will go into shops like this one. This is a refugee shop, and they will buy their energy there. Not all lighting is provided by the UN or by humanitarian organisations. The electricity situation is even worse. Most UN organisations do not provide electricity access of any kind, so people have to buy that themselves. They do from local shops, refugee-led shops, host community shops, and they don't just buy electricity products, and they also buy the services. So instead of having a computer in your home and having a printer with it, you go to a shop that does all of that, and you can access Facebook if you want, which is why I really enjoyed taking this photo, which I think really describes what it does do these days. And so they will go and they will pay, 10p, 50p, whatever the going rate is, to access some of those services, rather than having to be able to pay. And they will also pay to charge their mobile phones in touch shops, which are very, very informal spaces. Sometimes, this isn't the picture with the batteries on, I think, there will just be a guy who's just found a massive battery somewhere. He's got a little inverter on it, and he's just got loads and loads of phones coming out of an extension cable. Those places are not safe, and they quite often get overloaded, of course, and they zap people's phones. That's a technical term. And then people are without a phone, and it's so important that they have access to phones. And it's one of the number one costs that refugees report they're spending on is mobile phones and Wi-Fi and internet access. So that's how people access electricity in their homes, not in their homes quite often. You do also really often find electricity entrepreneurs, which I've written a couple of papers on, which are the most fascinating people on the earth as far as I'm concerned. It is always, and I've never met a woman, I've probably met 70, 20, 100 of these people. It's never a woman, it's always a man. He's found a generator somewhere, a generator that looks like that. And he's thought, I can fix that and I can make a business out of that. You would not believe how successful these people are. Some of them are the equivalent of millionaires at the camps. This is the most dangerous thing I've ever experienced in my life. The picture does not do it justice. I have got a video. The thing at the top, that's like a big pipe running down, was pouring water from one pipe to another because it didn't have its cooling on it. And then that was cooling around the thing. And anybody who knows anything about electricity can tell you, water and live electricity is a really, really, really bad idea. And I walked into this space, it's spitting, it's hissing, there's noise everywhere. I was with an electrical engineering colleague of mine, and she walked in and she froze, literally. There's wires everywhere, there's things everywhere. And she turned to me, she said, don't touch anything. And I said, yeah, I know enough about electricity not to be touching any wires. And she said, no, I think we might die here. She was really quite genuinely frightened. That said, that guy earns a business. You know, that's his business. He sells electricity. He connects homes. He connects businesses. They pay him a small fee. He goes out. He buys a bunch of diesel. He runs his generator. That's his whole livelihood, and he does very, very well from it. And I've got hundreds of pictures like that where it's exactly the same situation. The UN's got nothing to do with that. Again, some guy found or bought a generator, hooked it up himself. So I want to stress the importance of electricity entrepreneurs. And as we get further into the talk, you'll see why that's so important. Same could be said of cooking. There are all of these informal energy markets. I want to stress that they are informal. They are unregulated most of the time. They're unofficial. They're not recognised by the UN in many cases. And if you talk to a UN official and say, is there an energy market there? They'll say, no, there's no energy in the camp. There's no energy in the camp. But then if you tell them, I need to get my mobile phone fixed, or I need to charge my mobile phone, they will take you to a shop where you can do that. Every single camp I've ever been to, no matter how small, has informal energy markets. So this idea that refugees don't know about energy, or they don't have access to it, or they can't afford to pay for it, myth after myth after myth. Not deliberate myths, I should say, but still myths. So there are these informal energy markets everywhere. This is a picture of Nabaheke camp in Rwanda on top of a hill. And again, pictures don't do really justice, but all these shops connected here down this wire are all mini shops selling things. Some selling cold drinks, some being hairdressers, some being like laundromats, some being TV shops where you can pay and go and watch TV or a film. If you can think of it as a service, it is being provided in a refugee camp by some very enterprising person who's sometimes earning like 3 pence off every service they do. But that's how these informal economies of refugee camps work. And if you're interested in the informal economies, not just the energy bits, but the whole economies, the Refugee Studies Centre over here has a whole programme on that called Refugee Economies. And it has hundreds of reports about that with loads of actually quantitative data. Energy is a tiny pillar of what they do, but it explains how refugees earn income and spend it, and how these markets come to exist as well, which is an important part of the story. And I wish I could spend 2 hours on that, but we're talking about energy today, so I'll focus on that. The last space, or not last, but one of the really important spaces you see energy in the camps very visibly is for institutions, is for humanitarian organisations in the UN. If they're anywhere near remote, they will have the classic diesel generator full of diesel whirring away, and their offices will have air conditioning, you know, just like we are here today, really. It's tier 5 electricity access, and places like food distribution centres where they give out sacks of grain, sometimes water, things like that. That's a place like that where they have retinal scanners quite often. Obviously, they have computers and mobile phones and things to be able to do the administration associated with refugee life. And so those places are always electrified. Whether the generator's always on and working is an entirely different discussion. Sometimes it's not, and then people get very angry and start to leave. The humanitarian organisations start to leave. Refugees themselves, of course, are actually stuck there. And the number of times that I've interviewed just any humanitarian, like a protection officer or a safety officer, or a gender officer, registration officer, there's hundreds of these people in the camps, and I've said, do you know what powers the light or the projector or the computer that you're using? And they're like, no. And I was like, should we go and have a look at the generator? I consider it my personal mission to educate every single humanitarian that they're being powered by a diesel generator, which is a fossil fuel. And then I just tell them, listen, because you can always, they're super loud, these generators. You can just hear them whirring away. You just follow, even when I don't know where they are, you just literally follow your ears and you'll find the thing. And then they get amazed. They're like, oh, we didn't know, because loads of them have climate in their job description. And they're like, we're doing good things for the climate. And I'm like, your diesel is burning out the back. You can hear it, you can smell it. And they're like, oh, that's what that smell is, because they're not energy people at all. So the institutions always have power, and they're pretty selfish with it. They do not connect the households and the businesses in almost every situation. Some positives. I don't want to be too negative because I've got a super negative bit coming later on. Positive bit of the story is the sustainable solutions. There are some renewables starting, and I wouldn't want you guys to think I'm biased for solar or something. This isn't really about the industry picking winners. It's that solar is super cheap. The market is there already, especially in East Africa. And yeah, I mean, it's sunny in Africa. I mean, what I'm going to tell you. It's also windy, but it's not quite as easily available, I guess. So some solar solutions, you'll see lanterns like this. This is actually a tiny little handheld solar lantern. Sometimes you'll see bigger sets of panels, like this one that are about to be either sold or put on a school. So you will, and you'll sometimes see some individual solar home systems as well. Increasingly, there's a market for that being developed in some of the bigger camps. You will see some clean cooking projects, usually just 1 or 2 small cook stoves that have been distributed, usually for free. And there isn't much of a sustainable market behind many of those interventions. It's literally they've bought a bunch of cook stoves like that EnviroFit one, they've gone out and distributed it. They haven't asked the women and the families, do you use that? Is that useful? So I've been to households as a researcher where I've seen 5 or 6 cook stoves, not just like that one, but different types that have been distributed over time, and people saying, oh, I just don't use it. I've seen very innovative sort of heat thermal cook stoves just being used as waste paper baskets, because people are like, it's a really, really useful bin. And I'm like, I don't think the technologist who developed that in some lab in the West wants to know that you'll find it a really useful bin, or maybe they do. And then some of the more innovative technologies like this mini moto stove here, gasifier, small gasifier stove, doing quite well in those markets, but still people are always using multiple sources of energy to cook, just like we do here. You have your oven, you have your microwave, you have your kettle, you have your coffee maker, you have the waffle maker. Cooking is a multifaceted problem, and one cook stove won't cut it. It's not here, and not in refugee camps, not in the global south. I could rant again for 6 hours about cooking, but there are some clean cooking projects, but the sustainability of those, both in terms of financial sustainability, health sustainability, and carbon sustainability, is absolutely minimal. And again, we've just started publishing research on that, so the facts match my opinions. No. Where you will always find solar projects is in the refugee markets. These are both shops where you can buy, these are the D-light lanterns, if anybody recognises those. You can buy panels, you can buy solar home systems, you can buy a bunch of different stuff. If you want it, they'll get it for you. It'll be expensive, but it's a whole market economy based around energy. Some, increasingly a lot of which is solar, because people love that you don't have to pay for the diesel. You don't have to pay for the fuel. And the number of times I've heard people say, it's always sunny here and this is then free. Once I've bought it, the energy is free. That's how they describe it. It's not necessarily true in the sort of operational and maintenance side of things, but people really do see it in that way. You'll also see some solar public street lighting, again, not comprehensively done across camps. This is a solar street lamp. You will sometimes see just a random panel that's been attached to a light bulb that isn't getting the most out of things or connected to a lot of stuff, but it's happening. Somebody's got a panel and they've bunged it on a roof. And sometimes you will see bigger installations. This is on a school in Jordan that's helping the school both be more energy efficient and lower its fuel costs, because fuel is wildly expensive in Jordan. So there is some optimism about solar for institutions, and but it's not happening systematically, not at all. But there is space for hope. This is Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, where they've put in a massive solar array. They've done the same in Azraq, also in Jordan, to help with the Syrian refugee crisis. And as you can see, this is massive. This powers most of the tents in the camp, and it also powers the operations like schools, hospitals, etc. And it's a big success story. It did take them the better part of 7 years to do that and to develop it, but they had both of them. The first one really, really struggled because they had donor money behind it, and the Jordanian government was like, that's going to really wreck our grid if you put something massive at the end of it in the desert. And they had this massive governmental battle to get it there. UNHCR and the installers and IKEA Foundation, who funded it, won that battle in the end, but they won it with money. And there's no two ways about that. And now the Jordanian government has been very supportive of connecting refugee households because they've seen the benefits of quality of life. And that is a very progressive government doing progressive things. That is the exception, not the rule. There's probably 3 or 4 examples of that in the whole world, including 2 in Jordan, one quite massive one that's privately owned and operated in Kenya, and a series of large mini grids in Bangladesh, which is a whole Rohingya drama that would take 2 hours to explain. But that's the exception, not a rule. But there's space for hope, as my slide said. I want to turn now a little bit to the governance of access. It's very unusual, and so I wanted to highlight why it's so weird. Most people might expect that the UN just does it. It's a refugee camp. Why doesn't the UN just do it? Who supplies energy in refugee camps? Not the UN. That would be who. There are all these different groups. Governments, national governments, National Grid will sometimes connect humanitarian agencies. For example, for a head office sitting in Kigali, they'll connect them there. Governments or nationally owned operators might connect some displaced households and businesses in countries such as Jordan and in the global north, but not as a general rule in the global south. And it is different in every refugee camp in the world. Humanitarian agencies, do they supply? Sometimes they supply their own energy. They pay for their own generators. They pay for their own grid connections. And they will also provide the basic provision of firewood, which is never enough for refugee households, but they will supply that. NGOs, again, they buy their own generators and their own fuel. They deliver projects as well. So the cook stoves I showed, the lanterns, solar home systems, sometimes mini grids increasingly. That's organisations like GIZ, NRC, Mercy Corps, SNV, and refugees themselves. Of course, they buy their own energy, their lanterns, their cooking fuel, their electricity connections, and they pay a disproportionate amount for their energy, estimated to be between 15 and 40% of their disposable income. If you spent between 15 and 40% of your disposable income on energy, you would be so far into the fuel poverty curve. I don't think even the government would know what to do with you here. So it's extreme how much people will pay on energy because it's an essential item for them. And this, some people call this self-provision. I don't love the term because it's actually independent access through independent markets. It's a bit of a mouthful compared to self-provision, as opposed to provision from NGOs, provision from humanitarian agencies, or provision from governments. So that's who supplies, and there's serious complexity behind this. And I've tried to do a bit of a mapping of how it is in different camps, and I haven't yet found a camp, not even just within Kenya, but within Kenya, 3 main locations. It's not even the same there. So it's different in almost every location in the world, which is wild that it's so chaotic. I put this up. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in this room who supplies energy in displacement settings. All those people I just talked about, also the private sector, like energy isn't free. We live in a privatized energy world. I say this to humanitarians and they sort of gasp like, oh my God, we're paying for it and they're paying for it. Everybody's paying for it. And I'm like, yeah, energy's a privatized sector. It's just not for free. Governments buy their energy. Sometimes they have a national utility, so you can question whether that is buying it, but you know, money is exchanged. Humanitarian agency, they buy those generators, they buy the diesel, they buy that firewood, they pay for things. There's a bit of a myth that refugees and humanitarian agencies don't pay for things in that way, but they do. They have billions of pounds of budgets. The NGO is the same. They buy the generators, they buy the lanterns, etc. And displaced people, of course, buy their products more from local markets than from global or national ones, but they're still buying. So this idea that there can never be an energy economy, one, all those pictures that I showed you of energy entrepreneurs, and two, the fact that all of these people are exchanging money for energy, that totally disproves that. And one thing we try to do in the practitioner sector is say, if you're already paying money for it, you could spend your money more effectively and think about how you can do that with solar, with sustainable solutions, with sustainable financial business models, and try and bring our little energy bubble from the energy experts that I assume are in this room and online to that humanitarian world that knows nothing about the energy sector, and I mean nothing. And when we started 10 years ago, it was shocking, some of the questions that we got. Like, for example, somebody asked me, but energy, you know, is it really a sector? And I said, in humanitarian settings, I mean, no, not really. That's why we're making such a big deal out of it. And they were like, no, like in the world. And I was like, are you joking? And he was like, the guy said it. So, I mean, there's some companies, right? And I was like, there's some companies. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I went on this epic rant about what the hell. And you think that that's funny. I told that story to a member of the department here. And he said to me, you know, I thought the same about refugees. When you said you wanted to do a project on that, I thought, how many can there be? And at the time, there were about 60 million forcibly displaced people. He was like, no, that can't be true. I would have read about it in The Guardian. So these like total knowledge gaps. Some of you know the person that said that. I won't humiliate him here today by telling you. But that knowledge gap between the humanitarians over here knowing nothing about energy and the energy people over here knowing nothing about refugees was wild. It's coming together slowly, but it was, you know, insane. You had to adjust every language. I had slides at the beginning that said, if it turns on or off or gets rapidly hot or cold, it's energy. And I would go around these communities, humanitarian communities, UNHCR offices, with that as my like slogan. I should have got badges printed with it on, or on a t-shirt or something. And I would have a couple of people be like, no, that can't be true. And they would come up to me like as almost like a learning journey over years. And they would say, is this energy? Is this energy? Is this energy? And they would ask me whenever they would see me. Just spoiler alert, every single thing they pointed out was energy. And usually it was electrical. And I was like, yes, it's energy. It's a battery. And they would be like, oh, right. Okay, so the learning curve is very real. I come now to who governs energy. This slide is a hot mess deliberately. Sorry for all the logos, but I wanted to show the complexity of that. Who governs energy? It's everyone and no one. There are several main constituents, if you will. There's the humanitarian agencies, the big ones like UNHCR, IOM, International Organization for Migration, the World Food Programme. They are over there in the blue column there. They're mostly doing control and access of sites. They are not doing installation, program management, or delivery. They're doing control and access. Your development agencies, the UNDP, UNEP, Sustainable Energy for All, weirdly, UNITAR, don't get into why that is. They're providing quite often expertise and skills, and increasingly that sort of policy movement that can change things in a big way. Then you have your implementing partners, as so-called in the humanitarian system, and NGOs who are doing installations, they're doing delivery, they're doing distribution. It's groups like SMV, Mercy Corps, etc. Research organisations playing a disproportionately important role in this system by helping create it and analyse it and providing some of the data, much more so than you might see in other sectors in the global south or here in the north, providing the knowledge and the evidence, and also some of the movement and saying, actually, this is unjust what you're doing in excluding refugees. And over here, sorry, I should have made that blue. I should have made that white text. The donors, IKEA Foundation, Norwegians, Swedes, even the FCDO, providing funding and money and power that goes with it, literal power and political power. There are other donors involved, but these are the big dogs in humanitarian energy, or have been traditionally. We brought all of those groups together, the ones all sort of in this kind of blue, to be softly coordinated and governed by the GPA, which is Global Platform for Action. So that tries to bring them together and govern them in the loosest sense. But the private sector is largely not deliberately excluded, but excluded from the governance mechanisms. And that's a shame, because they're doing the supply and the provision. You might argue that's the most important bit, including refugee entrepreneurs. It's all very well inviting Shell and others and Total to the party, but these guys down here are doing the heavy lifting, and that is not reflected on this diagram deliberately, because governance and supply are different issues. And so this is chaotic. It's difficult. I want to just take a moment to reflect on why that matters, and that humanitarian responses on energy are often super chaotic. The governance of sustainable energy is super complex. I've been studying it for 10 years. Even I am just getting to grips with it. And then something will change and I'll be like, what is that organisation doing over there? And energy is not governed in a traditional way by the UN system. Has anybody heard of the humanitarian clusters? So I love talking to energy owners because it's like the biggest thing in humanitarian, and then nobody outside of humanitarian world has ever heard of it. They're basically like systematic organisations run by OCHA that get together to govern food as one, water as another, education. There's loads of them. There's like 11 of them. Logistics is another one. And they're supposed to be all the agencies like WFP and FAO, UNHCR, all the agencies that work together, and the big NGOs like Save the Children, UNICEF, etc. They're supposed to sort of put them in groups together of stuff they're good at and govern responses. So if a hurricane happens or a war happens, they go through the cluster and they say, right, you're in this location, you do this, you're in this location, you do this. And it's supposed to be a governance and allocation mechanism in emergency response. But it's become so chaotic and difficult, and the modern world doesn't fit with that system that was designed 30 years ago, that when we approached the Interagency Standing Committee, which runs the clusters, and said, should we have a cluster on energy? They were like, no, don't do that. The clusters don't work. And we said, wait, aren't you the guys that run the clusters? And they were like, yeah, but the clusters don't work. And we were like, right. So the fact that it's not governed traditionally energy, and that most refugees access energy independently of the UN and NGOs, mean that if you want to attack this problem, if you want to work on supplying energy to refugees, you need to think seriously about whether you go through the UN. Is that going to be effective if they're not doing most of the work? Question mark, question mark, question mark. I know the answer. After 10 years of doing it, I know the answer. Refugees are also not included in decision making. So some guy sitting in the UN, usually in Geneva, who says, okay, it'll be this lantern. He doesn't care if it's tier 0, tier 1. He doesn't care if it has a phone charger in it. He's like, that was the cheapest one on my tender that came in. So tick, that's what you'll be getting. Says nothing about use, nothing about sustainability, particularly usually. It's a dark picture, literally and morally. And as a result of that, displaced people are being left behind in the global sustainable energy transition. And even SC for All came out a couple of years ago and said that. And Rachel Kite, for all her faults, said that very, very publicly, that this is now over 1% of the world's population. They're just being largely ignored. Not if I have anything to do about it. It's not, but right, reflections. Sorry, I get angrier and angrier and angrier as I go through these presentations. Reflections. I want to talk a little bit about visible versus invisible energy now, and whether energy is a human right. If you came to this cold without listening to my talk and you just Googled energy and humanitarian, hopefully you come to the GPA website and get some nuance. But if you didn't and you Googled energy and UNHCR, this is what you would get. Almost all the pictures in this presentation are mine, but not these. Credits given. They're all published within the 2019 Global Sustainable Energy Strategy that UNHCR published a couple of years ago. Almost every picture you will see is a Black African woman standing, holding some sort of energy technology, pretending to look happy about it. 1, 2, 3. Those are actually in Bangladesh. Underneath their solar street light, which is quite difficult to take pictures of when they're on again. And you'll see that picture and it might make you think, oh, loads is happening and everybody's getting a solar lantern and they're also getting solar street lights and they're getting efficient cooking mechanisms. The UN is really solving this problem. But UNHCR themselves, in that very report and in their report in 2022 as well, acknowledged that their energy distribution of services only meets 1.5% of the world's displaced people, which is a tiny amount. And if you count the new numbers of displaced people coming in, that number falls to a less than 1%. It's also only partial coverage. So if you've got that solar lantern, pretty sure you can all guess what that does, has a phone charger in it because it says so on the box. If you've got that solar lantern, would that meet all your energy needs? Would it be charging for your computer? Would it be Wi-Fi? Would it be a hot bath? Would it be a kettle? Would it be a cooker? No, it wouldn't. And yet they count it in the 1.5%, which is unethical and also factually inaccurate. And they count, for example, when they put up street lighting like that they've electrified the whole refugee camp. But that putting up a street light is not providing household electricity, as we constantly say to them. And they say, well, we've only got the data we've got. I said, I know some people who can help you with that. Anyway, so you see lots of these pictures, these very visible parts of the energy system, and UNHCR and others try and make them really, really visible. What you see less of in those reports and in policy discussions and everywhere else is these invisible elements. Invisible to who? This probably wouldn't be invisible to anybody in this room. You'd go into that and you'd say that's an energy space. But you don't see those pictures of those diverse energy products, of the surfaces, of the uses. And you also don't see criticism of the fact that UN spaces like this one, UN conference hall over here, at Kakuma refugee camp, are super electrified. And this space, my favourite spaces in the whole world, I spent years of my life in that room, is basically like, imagine a really old-fashioned village hall from the 1930s. It's like that, and the air conditioners are stuck on cold, and the person who runs the room does not know how to change them. Whether it's a fault with the system or it just doesn't know how to use the remote, who knows? And as a result, it's ice cold in there. I've been in there with a winter UK jacket on and still being cold. And as a result, they leave the door to that room open so that the heat from the Turkana Desert in Kenya can come into the room to balance the freezing air conditioning. I mean, inefficiency doesn't even cover that. It's borderline criminal. And it's, you know, that's why people in 35-degree heat are wearing like full Western jackets. And so those spaces are invisible unless you take a picture of them and you show that picture and you say, that's electricity, that's electricity, that's electricity, that's a diesel generator. And then they go, oh, I didn't know that. It's not invisible to us, but it is to the humanitarian system. So I wrote a paper on it, a very irate, irritated paper that none of those humanitarians will ever read. But then I spend my life doing talks like this to try and get them to. I say that there's a secret life of energy in humanitarian settings. I make a couple of elements of that undiscovered side of things. I say that energy connections are invisible, as the photos I just showed tries to highlight, and that when you think of humanitarian technologies, you think of the shelters, you think of the tents, you think of food, you think of blankets, you think of water maybe, but you don't think necessarily of the cook stoves, of the matches, of the firewood, of the power connectors, etc. Secondly, I make a point about secrecy because it's a bit invisible and underneath, it means marginalized. Energy isn't viewed as an important thing, and I'm about to put a slide up on that, and that energy technologies are marginalized within humanitarian practices. And just as an example of that, UNHCR generally in Geneva have 3 global energy experts. That's it, for a constituent of 110 million people. And 2 of those recently fired. So they've got 1 now, a lady clinging on, an electrical engineer, thinking, what on earth am I doing with my life, trying to run energy for 110 million people? Single-handedly, that's not a joke, that's her job description. So it is marginalised as an issue. How are you going to do that as a job? Thirdly, refugees and IDPs often supply their own access to energy independently of humanitarian providers, and that independent access is marginalised because it's not recorded or recognised within humanitarian systems. And I've been given tours of camps by UNHCR and others, it's not just them, but IOM, WFP, all of them. Tours of camps where they said there's no energy in this camp. I will walk in there and I'll say, that's wiring, what is it attached to? And they say, oh, that's just a generator, or oh, that's a solar home system, we didn't give that away, so it doesn't count. We didn't give it to them, so it doesn't count. Finally, energy needs are methodologically, it's more an academic point, methodologically challenging to reveal. I've had loads of master's students, even PhD students I've had to co-supervise. There are no humanitarian energy professors, and so it's hard to get a PhD going on it. I was very lucky. I got Nick Eyre to supervise me from here, and Tom Scott Smith from International Development, who were the energy and humanitarian brains. And together I met them in the middle. But it's also difficult to access camps. You have to get certain amounts of permissions. You have to know where to go. You have to know the right people to get access. And if I wasn't working as a practitioner or as a donor before that, I would never have been able to do the work that I was able to do. Simultaneously, when I did get there and I was being introduced by UNHCR and the humanitarian organisations, it was very clear to me the positionality I was being put in, which was to review their energy programmes positively. And the worst thing that I think has ever happened to me in fieldwork was one morning we were going around quite early. It was about 8 a.m. We were in one of the big UNHCR branded jeeps, and the guy was really annoyed about the energy programming. And he was saying, "Oh, these women, they don't understand cooking. You know, they won't use our cook stoves." And I was trying to tell him, that's because they're not useful for them. You should maybe have talked to them before you just bunged them a bit of kit. I didn't tell him like that. And he was saying, "Oh, no, we'll go to this woman. You'll see what she's like." And he literally walked up to her house, walked in through the front door, did not knock, and dragged her out by her scarf, dragged her out, started yelling at her in Swahili, and then said, look, and then pointed like this really aggressively at her cook stove. She's sputtering around, trying to pick everything up. You know, he's a very important person in her life. He's an authority figure. She's effectively being abused by him. And he's like, get your cook stove going because this woman wants to see it. And I was like, I will never engage in that type of field work ever again. Like, you have to work independently in that system in order to be ethical. And so this is the type of methodological challenges. That situation was not on methodological challenge, it was horrific, that you see. And unless you go along with that system, you know, you're not allowed access. I found some ways around that. Questions afterwards. So anyway, I write a lot about that in the paper and about some of these methodological aspects. Energy access is a human right. I'm going to read this quote in a minute. We might agree in this room as energy people or online that energy is a human right. Not all refugee studies academics and not all practitioners support this idea. You'd be shocked. Energy is seen as a luxury in many points. And this quote, I did a lot of ethnographic work and a lot of semi-structured work. This is a quote. This man said this in front of other people. I would be ashamed to even think it, let alone say it in front of others. I asked him, will you go beyond, not quite like this, but will you go beyond tier 0, tier 1 in the World Bank framework? Will you go to bigger energy technologies beyond just lanterns or a few light bulbs? And he said, no. Look, it's just the basic technologies refugees need. We are only here doing life-saving stuff, the basic things. Emergency action is blankets and bottles and tents, not these things you're talking about, energy. You can live without a lantern. We can't provide all the luxuries. Really, once you start with that, where do you stop? Next, we will have to provide Wi-Fi and smartphones. What will the donors say? They will say, you are providing luxury development more than people need to survive. We will be accused of being the luxury agency. No, we have to stick to the basic poverty goods, the non-food items, NFIs. For my operation, who's in charge of massive amount of budgets. For my operation, the rule of the thumb is, if you don't die without it, you don't get it. That applies to energy. You don't die without energy, so you don't get it. And anybody who's ever had a baby in a NICU will tell you, you do die without energy. Anybody who's ever been in hospital, anybody who's not had their water purified will tell you, you can die without energy. But he saw energy as an absolute luxury, in the same way that a designer handbag is luxury. So there's some of the challenging opinions. I've got dozens of quotes. That's a really sensationalist one. I have dozens and dozens of quotes of humanitarians saying stuff like that. Shocking perhaps, but it's the reality of it. And it is common language within the just absolute brutality of humanitarianism. Well, it's super negative note to end on. I'm going to do a couple, just 2 more slides on further resources. Just switch tack totally. Further resources, positive ones from policy and practice. This is a great website, humanitarianenergy.org. It's got loads of jobs, it's got loads of resources, it's got loads of links, and they publish the State of the Humanitarian Energy Sector report every year. The one from 2022 is an absolute beast. It's 313 pages that we wrote together, and it really, really goes into loads of detail if you're interested in research or learning more about this topic in a practical, how it is in the world sense. And I'll just highlight some of the chapters to show that if you're interested in a particular topic for the students. Chapter 1 is about energy needs and what energy people actually use. Chapter 2 about coordination and governance, some of the things I thought about today. Chapter 3 about policy and progress. Some of the facts, the statistics I presented at the beginning are in there. Chapter 4 on funding and financing, what a little murky world that is. Chapter 5 on delivery and capacity and how many staff there are working on these issues and where and which organisations. Chapter 6, the classic, data and evidence. Chapter 7 on climate action and trying to bring together some of the climate mitigation and adaptation and energy issues together. And chapters 8 to 9 on practical advice, recommendations, conclusions and summary. And I do think we spent a long time on it. It's a good resource. It's a foundational resource. The refugee-led research hub down the road at the Refugee Studies Centre helped us review and write all the different sections so that it was coming from refugee voices as well as just Westerners, and they were, especially in chapter 1, they were really, really, co-authoring and writing together with us. That's on the practical side. On the academic side, there's this energy research and social science article that I've written, and the Journal of Refugee Studies is where I published the Secret Life of Energy paper. There is also, it's not all papers on humanitarian energy are written by me, a huge Zotero library. It's now near to 600 resources. So this idea that this isn't an academic topic, I have disproved by making a public Zotero library. And that's public for anybody who wants to access that. The links to it are in the ERSS paper, which is public. We try and do as much as we can to get it open access and public so that people can really start using the minimal but interesting data that is out there. So academic resources that are there. And a little plug, just because I love to do that. I've got a book out in October. They finally give me a release date, which is lovely, called Voices in the Dark, The Energy Lives of Refugees, which is based on the ethnographic study I did for my DPhil, published by Berghain under their Forced Migration series. Please do reach out and email me, Twitter, whatever, it's not called that anymore, but whatever, with questions and links, and do go on the GPA practitioners group, which I think you mentioned at the beginning, if you're interested in getting jobs, because I get questions about jobs in every single presentation I do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. I think we heard about the book as well. We got a plug in at the end. A very quick question, which comes from community engagement in the UK, which I know is not translatable. But my question is, if you have an infrastructure resource which is associated with displaced people, is it possible to engage some of those people in the maintenance of that resource? Because I'm looking at all the solar panels you had there, which look dusty. So if everyone took turns cleaning the dust off so that it was slightly more efficient, I'm just wondering if there's an element of not necessarily ownership, but at least investment in the performance of that system that could allow people to engage slightly with it, rather than it being a supply and demand
type of arrangement. And there are some community-based models I didn't talk about particularly today, in Ethiopia particularly, and in Rwanda. They've done a great project with Coventry University about community engagement, where local energy companies that were supplying the panels and the solar home systems, etc., hire refugees as part of their staff, both for operation and maintenance, but also for, installing things. And you do actually find a surprising number of electrical engineers, formally trained or otherwise, because of experimenting with wires at some point. You'd meet people you believe who could do things you wouldn't believe, who have no qualifications and no written.
Assuming the Darwinian principles apply, they're still alive. They've worked with it for a while.
Honestly, some of them aren't. And one extreme example, I met a guy, and he was in that very dangerous diesel generator space. And I was saying, is it really dangerous though? And he said, ask my friend who burns himself. And the guy's, I have no arm. I mean, it was just totally scarred. So yeah, accidents do happen. And with kerosene for cooking, or with LPG for cooking, I haven't presented on that today, but it's very common. So those community-based models are there, and we try and encourage them as much as possible. But it's 1,000 situations, and everyone's individual. There's no system for it. So you'd have to go to every single project manager or supplier, which I feel I've been doing that for the last 10 years. I don't know. I haven't kept a record of how many of them I've personally presented to.
Sounds like you help out there.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Tina, you've got reflections on what Sarah shared?
But I mean, it's just amazing. It's not something I know anything about. My work's been in the UK and Europe, so to hear this, it's just quite astounding. And I sometimes read these things about, oh well, we're going to do carbon offsets by clean cooking, and we must think bits of questionable.
Yeah.
And I'd just be, but then sometimes we've got this quite a few of them might say things about all these clean cooking things, they're win-win if they're done right. So I mean, can that, if it's done correctly, do you think that is a sort of technological intervention that can work for people, or is it just always because it was been too top down? Are there good examples of where it really could be helpful?
For the cook stoves, particularly for offsetting, I'd never pay money towards it.
No. Well, I wasn't really thinking. I was thinking more for clean cooking. I mean, to improve people's health and get them onto.
It doesn't. That's another thing that the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves should be shouting from the roof. They've commissioned loads and loads of studies from like Johns Hopkins University and all sorts that prove that unless that stove is above tier 4 for indoor emissions, which almost none of them are, no wood burning fuel, no charcoal burning stove on the market today is above that level. It doesn't actually improve health outcomes. So every single cook stove in the world is still poisoning people to a slightly lesser degree, potentially, especially if you have it standing on something and that you're not physically, I don't know if you've seen women physically crouching over it. And so, no, I don't believe that. They've done studies, several companies have done studies, especially to prove that they are producing less carbon through an improved cook stove. And you could say that's offsetting. I still say you burn the fossil fuels, or you're burning firewood and you're not replanting. And so if you're burning stuff, it's still emitting carbon. It might be emitting slightly less carbon, but overall, it's not a systematic solution. It's not a scalable solution. And the clean cook stove sector has propagated this idea that it is, but it isn't. It's lots of companies making these small cook stoves. So no, I wouldn't do it. The carbon offsetting as a separate issue, there are some of those programs that invest in sustainable electricity programs, like with solar panels for Indian schools and stuff like that. Those ones I'd consider and have pointed to people to before, but not cook stove program. No, they're almost all unreliable, undocumented, untraceable. The data isn't there to support it. I mean, the Global Alliance will probably try and have me fired for saying it, but
yes.
We also have Nick Jolly on the call behind solar cookers, which obviously have a fossil fuel free input of energy, but I guess you can then use them at certain times of the day.
Well, increasingly not for the electricity fueled ones, for the e-cooking, which I think is what he's asking about. And MEX, if you guys know the Modern Energy Cooking program run by Loughborough University, done amazing research and made amazing progress on that topic in general in Global South, and now reaching into humanitarian settings as well. So there is definite potential there. It's just a very difficult environment to test in because you don't want to test with hyper vulnerable communities. So that's one of the reasons I can't really see this question, but it popped up something about.
It's my job. So.
Yeah, I won't do your job for you. E-fuels help for cooking. Yes, in theory, it's very hard to do in practice. And Ivana Basaga and Longsen Tao wrote a great paper on that from MEX a couple of years ago about how this system is almost stacked against e-cooking and how difficult that is in different spaces, but it doesn't mean it's not a good thing to try and do. And there are increasingly projects that want to try and do that. Coventry University also have a project at the moment. They're trying to get funding that works on e-cooking and digital innovation, things like that. There's loads of innovation happening. It's more, I would flag though, that it's more process innovation rather than product innovation. If you're trying to invent a new cook stove, don't come to a refugee camp and try and test it, because UNHCR and others will get really annoyed about it because they've tried to do that so many times in the past. In fact, in our sector, it's called pilotitis because they're so sick of pilots. If you've got a process innovation where you can try and scale something or do something with a certain community, that's different, but that is a different type of innovation.
Can we also look at the development agencies themselves? You've shown that they're using a lot of energy there. They could adapt so they don't need as much cooling, for example. They could have slightly more efficient appliances. And if they're the major energy users in the camp, perhaps you'd get better reduction of carbon emissions by just focusing on the people who supposedly are allowed the luxury of energy.
Yeah.
Is that a ripe area, or can we tell them to mark their own homework?
Yeah, I deleted the slide that talks about that actually, because they do mark their own homework, and badly so. But there are two big initiatives for that. One is with UNHCR. That's do you know the greening the blue thing? No? Okay, it's a big initiative across the UN to help the UN go sustainable and go solar particularly. And it's not just the humanitarian agencies, it's UNDP, it's all of them. In different agencies, it's happening with different levels of success. UNDP got quite a good programme going through it. WFP, with their fuel and their flight allowances, they've got quite a decent programme going. Other organisations have big funds set up to do it, but it's a case of they don't know what they don't know. So they don't even know how to spend the money. And you're thinking, well, just get rid of your diesel generators and replace them with solar. But that for them is incredibly complicated, because it's about procurement, it's about legal rights, it's about existing investments. And they don't understand any of it because some guys just bought diesel generators and now they're left with this sort of ancient stock. And so, yes, it's a right area. Yes, we should do it. It is the thing that will contribute most in terms of CO2 reduction. And chapter 7, I think, in the SOHES report talks explicitly about that and some of the numbers behind it. What you see from the UN agencies, sorry, I've really bashed the UN today, particularly bad mood with them this week, is that they are self-reporting their carbon emissions, and that anybody who knows anything about carbon emissions knows that shouldn't be the case. Some systems like the WFP flights monitor is based on actual flights, so it's a bit more vigorous data. In the case of UNHCR, they had Excel spreadsheet. They sent out Google survey, and they got protection officers and security officers to guess how much energy they were using. And the guys didn't even know the units. They were like 4. I was like, 4 what? And they were like, it seems about 4. And I was like, is it a kilowatt? Is it a what? What are you talking about?
We've had secretaries of state for energy who don't know what unit of energy is either. So
exactly. And you ask them, like, are there some solar? Is there a sustainable approach? And it was a yes or no question. And so that when you look at it like that, you start to think, okay, and then that's aggregated up into this green and blue system, and it comes out looking really positive because there's some nice things in the spreadsheet. That's not the reality. There are 11,000 humanitarian generators around the world still burning diesel every day.
But maybe we meant to encourage them by saying you're doing a good job, you're heading in the right direction as the figures show, and then help them to do with some more.
Did paternalistic patronisation ever work ever in the history of time?
No, it didn't. That's why I'm not a lecturer here. Are there any other questions?
I was just wondering, because sort of like back to the ovens a little bit, being a bit useless, were there any like energy technologies that were actually really beneficial that people found really useful?
The solar home systems have been transformative. And they can be absolutely tiny ones, they can be bigger ones. People have made businesses out of them. I've seen solar cinemas where people have just got quite a large system and they've got a TV and they've hooked it all up. They've been phenomenal, and you can get pay-as-you-go ones, you can get microfinancing for it. That's a whole market, especially in East Africa. And that has been transformational for people in terms of their business and their day-to-day quality of life.
So you could have had a good slide then.
Yeah, I have got a more positive presentation, but I just did a Gresham lecture 2 weeks ago that was super negative and people were really surprised by the situation. And I thought, actually, it's time these days to pay a bit of attention to the negatives.
Solar home.
A solar home system. It's a solar panel. Oh my God, I feel like I'm going to be so judged for this explanation. It's a solar panel, sometimes multiple solar panels with some wires running off it, usually an inverter, and it has a few light bulbs attached to it. Maybe some mobile charging, It's literally just a tiny mini little system, but it's
So
beyond
you
the
must have
land.
some energy storage as well to bridge it across to night.
Not always.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and then you think you need the light bulbs when it's dark, right? Which is crazy.
That was my guess.
Yeah, I know, but not all of them. Most of them, the more modern, so you can buy them on Amazon. But there's a whole industry for that in East Africa because they're super decentralized. They don't need to be plugged into any grid. It's just a piece of kit, just like it's a big lantern, really, in terms of its technology. It's not particularly novel or interesting. But when they have a mobile phone charger in them, which is just a USB port, so you can use it for a computer. I mean, it will run out like that, most of them, but you can use it.
Nick Jelly's just asking a question about, is there enough power from that to do cooking? My guess is the answer is no.
For the bigger systems and for the super effective, like induction style hot plates, essentially, they've done some trials on that. It is, as any electrical person will know, like trying to combine electricity with thermal energy is like super inefficient. So there are some efficient ways to do that, but the trouble with induction cooking particularly is it requires refugee communities, displaced communities to have induction pans, and that's difficult enough here. So there's loads of potential. I don't want to put anybody off e-cooking or that kind of stuff, but the potential is there certainly, but the realities of making it work are really tripping it up.
So do you have a question?
Yeah, so I guess if you're building an energy system for a refugee camp, it's how much do you consider the fact that they might be displaced from where they are? I guess because, so for example, you mentioned the Jordanian example where it took 7 years. Well, if you knew the people would be here for that long, then it becomes much easier, I imagine. So how do you consider for people that might be removed?
Yeah, and it's really almost a myth of humanitarianism. I mean, the average life of a refugee camp is now at 21 years, and that's a growing average every year that these crises go on. And what the Jordanians said was they hoped the Syrian crisis would be over in a year or two, but they said we are a stable country, yes, as Jordan in the Middle East. They published a whole strategy on this about energy and sustainability and environment. There will always be people coming here. There will always be war in the Middle East, at least for the foreseeable future. And so we will invest in this space. And if everything goes wonderfully in Syria and the people go home, someone else will come, because that's been their experience. With the Afghan wars, with the Iraqi wars, with the conflict now in Gaza, that is a space that people will come to. And as it has happened, what are we at 12, 13 years since the Syrian war started? So they were smart to see it like that. And increasingly governments do see it like that. And that this whole idea that all these refugees will go home is a bit changing. Some people do go home, some people get resettled, some people integrate and marry a local or find a different way to integrate, get a job, for example, if you're allowed to work, and go off the refugee register, if you like. But overall, the number of refugees and displaced people is growing year on year on year. I don't know if I answered your question. If people go home, if you're designing a system,
yeah, that needs to be moved, even if it's not people leaving, but
so almost all the systems we deal with are decentralized, so they can move. Like a mini grid, you can just pick it up and move it. Solar home systems, just pick them up and move them. Solar lanterns, they go with people. But people generally don't move. These are mostly protracted crises we're talking about. And all the transit centres that you see, which is where you do see a lot of people coming in and out and moving around and being relocated to different parts of whatever country they're in, or sometimes other countries. Those places are institutions. You can think of them like a school. So they're always going to be there. Well, not always. Maybe if a country really doesn't experience displacement of people coming to it, then those institutions, those buildings are still needed for something. People will take on that building, so why not solarize it? And that's the approach you see in Rwanda. I'm saying actually maybe there won't be a Burundian refugee crisis in a couple of years because things are calming down there, in theory. But we'll still solarize all our transit centres because we will use them as a national government for something else, and then they'll be solarized. So that forward planning, which is only really 1 or 2, 3, 4 years planning, not 20 years, in terms of sort of, we need electricity here in the next few years, rather than return on investment planning. So when you're designing a system, it's a battle with the institution usually to persuade them to look long term rather than what they're doing now. But we've seen a lot of change on that in the last 10 years, because when we started with the Moving Energy Initiative back in 2013, we had representatives from UNHCR whose job it is to know protracted displacement saying, well, the refugees could move. And I said, okay, well, I'm in Palestine. I haven't moved for the last 47 years. So where do you think they're going? You know, generational histories. The same with the community in Bangladesh with the Rohingyas. It's really a long time. So
I think you've convinced us the challenge is growing and probably needs to be tackled at the roots. The regional distribution centres just need to have all the diesel generated sets taken away and given them something
yeah.
else that they have to use, and then they'll just absolutely.
Well, and it's a legal clause to get them to do that, to buy new things. I've been campaigning for that for some time. It's unsuccessful.
So if there are no other questions, maybe. Oh, sorry, Tim.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just when I was just thinking about your energy entrepreneurs, how important they are in the system, whether there's some way of engaging, you know, making it easy for them to offer, you know, to base their energy business on solar,
Yeah.
things that are less dangerous for them and the environment. And it is there's some sort of going. I don't know how that would happen. But
Yeah. A lot of the projects, our humanitarian energy projects do that, called what they call market activation projects, where they take existing solar suppliers and solar technologies and sort of showcase them. It's almost like a behavioural change type of activity, think of it a bit like that. And they do solar marketplaces and things like that to show people these are the technologies you can buy. Here are the big global suppliers, often based in China or Germany or somewhere. And here are the routes to do that, and here are the businesses you could make out of it. You know, there's supermarkets there who are just using the lighting for solar panels just for lighting, really, and then maybe a little bit of electricity. And you say, well, actually, you know, you've got this big warehouse, you could offer cooling in there, you could offer cooling drinks, you could expand your business with solar. That's the kind of line. And then people see it as an investment opportunity. And so, yes, that type of work is being done. There's a big project in Rwanda called the Renewable Energy for Refugees program, which is trying to be countrywide to inspire those types of businesses and work with them to solarize essentially and build a really sustainable thing. Because once that's going and people do it, it builds and builds and builds. So there is loads of success. I didn't present it. It's a different world from 10 years ago.
Okay, let's say thanks once more to Sarah. Thank you. And don't forget to register for the Julie Newman talk next Tuesday if you can do in the next same time. Okay, thanks very much.